Ladies and gentlemen, I always feel a little uncomfortable at being introduced as a professor of philosophy. The term has something to do with wisdom, and I remember a story that William James, one of our finest philosophers, once told about his being in the smoking car of a train and getting into conversation with a number of other men who proved to be selling soap and shoes and underwear and a number of other things. And finally, when everybody else had spoken, they turned to William James and said, "And what do you sell?" And he avers that he found it rather hard to answer. There is some presumption in setting out to be a professor of wisdom, but I console myself with the thought that the term philosophy means a lover or seeker of wisdom, and that there is an interesting and perhaps somewhat ironical implication in the term that the philosopher seeks without too much hope of finding. At any rate, it is true, I think, that from the very beginnings of philosophy, the philosopher has been distinguished from other scholars by the earnestness and the determination with which he presses his questions. And one aspect of the questioning that is typically philosophical is analytic in a sense which I hope to explain before the end of this lecture. Philosophical analysis is certainly as old as philosophy itself. But nowadays, the term is used to cover certain methods which are quite modern. They are methods practiced mainly by younger philosophers, both in this country and in Great Britain. And I think the best way to understand what these methods are, the questions that these philosophers are setting themselves, and the answers they hope to get, is to take a quick look at some of the history behind this movement. If what I say is familiar to you, as it may well be in part, I hope you will forgive me. I think we have to go back to the 17th century and to the outstanding figure of Descartes. Modern philosophy in the textbooks is very often reckoned as starting with Descartes, and for a very good reason. Descartes can be regarded as the man who made the final breach with the theory of the universe, the harmonious and on the whole satisfying theory of the universe that the Western world owed to Aristotle and to St. Thomas. It was a time, as you know, when men were beginning to question seriously the basis of the authority that had been handed down to them in intellectual as well as in political matters. And it is highly significant that Descartes, as he himself said, tried to discover a basis of absolute certainty by himself, not by appeal to the dicta of the master of Aristotle, nor by submission to the edicts of the church, but by the light of reason itself. Let me read to you the passage that opens his great book, The Meditations, written in 1641. Descartes says, "It is now several years since I first became aware how many false opinions I had from my childhood been admitting as true, and how doubtful was everything I have subsequently based on them. Accordingly, I have ever since been convinced that if I am to establish anything firm and lasting in the sciences, I must once and for all, and by a deliberate effort, rid myself of all those opinions to which I have hitherto given credence, starting entirely anew and building from the foundations up. This is a story, and a famous one, that has been told many times, of how Descartes set himself to doubt everything that a man could set himself to doubt, imagining perhaps that some malicious demon was presenting to him, as if in a dream, all the appearances which before his doubting seemed to him to be realities, and how, stripping from his mind one belief after another that he had taken to be certain, he was finally left only with the notion that at any rate he himself was doubting, was thinking, and therefore at least he himself existed. Now this is a very famous episode in the history of philosophy and in the development of Western civilization. And the significance is partly this, that whereas Descartes hoped by doubting everything that he could set himself to doubt, to find in reason itself a basis of absolute authority, a basis he thought that would guarantee even the existence of God himself, that though this was the intent, the outcome was almost entirely negative. I don't believe that anybody since Descartes has really been convinced that Descartes did arrive at absolute certainty. I don't think that a man can be convinced by Descartes' proof of the existence of God. And in fact, it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that with Descartes, the ghost of skepticism enters modern philosophy. From that time on, every philosopher is haunted by the thought that, as Descartes said, things which everybody takes for granted and is quite sure must be true turn out on inspection to be not certain and to be open to the gravest objections. When Hume, writing in the early part of the 18th century, brought these skeptical doubts into the open, I think he was only making explicit what was already latent in Descartes' philosophizing. From that time onwards, every philosopher, professional or amateur, who seriously asked himself what was the evidence for, say, the existence even of a chair or a table, let alone the existence of God or such important matters, every such philosopher, I think, was compelled to say that fundamentally he didn't know the answer. Skepticism has been the skeleton in the philosophical cupboard ever since, and it has rattled for everybody who had ears to hear. I'm not going to try to take you through the history of philosophy. I want to take a big jump now and come to the beginning of this century. We find at this time that both in this country and in England, the dominant influence was the movement which is called in the textbooks Anglo-Hegelianism. It was represented by such men as Bradley and Bosanquet and MacTaggart, to name three of the most famous. It was derived, as the name suggests, from the teaching of Hegel himself. And for our purpose, all that we need to notice is that the teaching of these outstanding men was of a very remarkable and esoteric character. They made a sharp distinction between appearance and reality. They claimed that what the ordinary man thought he knew was utterly mistaken. They said that the very notion of time was self-contradictory, and they came out with the most remarkable and, if true, important ideas about the nature of the universe. Let me quote to you this time the last passage of Bradley's famous book, Appearance and Reality, written in 1893. He says, "This is the essential message of Hegel. Outside of spirit, there is not and there cannot be any reality. And the more anything is spiritual, so much the more is it veritably real." You have to bear in mind that for Bradley, as for these other philosophers at the turn of the century, spirit had a very special meaning. And I think if you're not already familiar with this part of Anglo-Saxon philosophy, you will be astounded at the conclusions that these philosophers claim to be able to draw about the real nature of the universe. Now, the surprising thing is that today, only 50 years or so later, idealism of the Anglo-Hegelian type is just about dead, both in this country and in England. And this is a very remarkable thing, and the way that it happened is, I think, also somewhat interesting. I believe that so far as technical philosophers go, the key figure in the refutation of idealism was a man now very old, but still alive, George Edward Moore, born in 1873. Among professional philosophers, his most famous work is perhaps a paper he wrote in 1903 called The Refutation of Idealism. Like other refutations in philosophy, it didn't really convince the enemy. It merely heartened people on his own side. But I think it certainly caused trouble in the idealistic camp. But still more important than this one formal refutation that Moore provided was a very remarkable paper that he wrote in 1925 called The Defense of Common Sense. And I want to tell you a little about this, because without it, I think you can hardly understand what the contemporary analysts are doing and where they derive the inspiration for their work. The main point in Moore's defense of common sense can be summarized in a sentence that he himself used. He said, "The common sense view of the world is, in certain fundamental respects, wholly true." And by the common sense view of the world, Moore meant just what you might expect him to mean. He meant that, for example, when I look in front of me now and think that I see a great many different bodies, what I see is literally true. There are many bodies in this lecture room. And when I claim to know that with each body there is associated a person exactly like myself, who can hear what I say and can think what he likes about what I'm saying, that what I say is literally true. And that when I say that the world probably existed a very long time indeed before human beings had any place on it, what I say is again literally true. These truths Moore calls truisms. They are indeed exceedingly obvious. They are what the man in the street would regard as so plainly true that to have them challenged would seem to him to be the height of absurdity. And it might well seem absurd that it should be left until 1925 for a philosopher of the highest eminence to come forward and say solemnly what the ordinary man in the street in a sense, if More is right, knew all the time. But the paradox is only apparent. Question the man in the street, and you turn him at once into a philosopher. Start asking him how he knows that the sun will rise tomorrow, and he will confess in very short order that he doesn't really know. In fact, the man in the street is just as good a philosopher, potentially, as anybody else. And the fact is that what More was saying was, in a very important sense, revolutionary. What he was saying was certainly incompatible with most of the major doctrines of most of the great classical philosophers of the past. He's been compared to the child in the fable of the emperor's new clothes, who suddenly calls out, he hasn't any clothes on after all. This was the still small voice of a man who really did believe that common sense could stand up against all the criticism that had been brought against it in the course of nearly 2,000 years of philosophizing by some of the best minds of the race. Now, I must spare you the technical details of this. More is a philosopher's philosopher, hardly known outside the circles of professional philosophy, but in those circles, a man who's had the greatest of influence. Let me read you a passage that Russell wrote a few years ago in explaining the influence that More had upon him and other young philosophers early in this century. Russell says, More took the lead in rebellion, and I followed with a sense of emancipation. Bradley argued that everything common sense believes in is mere appearance. We reverted to the opposite extreme and thought everything is real that common sense, uninfluenced by philosophy or theology, supposes real. With a sense of escaping from prison, we allowed ourselves to think that grass is green, that the sun and stars would exist if no one was aware of them, and so on. The world, which had been thin and logical, suddenly became rich and varied and solid. Now, if it is once assumed, as many people did assume, that More was right in his main contention, then the ghost of skepticism can be laid to rest. A philosopher need no longer torment himself with the idea that perhaps he knows nothing at all. He can, if More is right, be perfectly certain that he knows all manner of things. But here comes a decisive twist. What is it that the philosopher knows? If the philosopher knows for certain that there are material bodies, what exactly is it that he is knowing? And More himself made a great point of this. He said, while it is quite certain that we know all manner of things about material bodies, other minds, the world, and so on, the meaning of what we assert when we rightfully say we know these things is not clear. And so you get here a decisive switch from questions of evidence to questions of meaning. Let us consider briefly the place of Russell in this development. Bertrand Russell was strongly influenced by More, but he didn't stay with More's acceptance of common sense. What Russell said was that while common sense is on the whole and undoubtedly correct in what it says, it also contains a good deal of inherited superstition and intellectual rubbish of one sort and another. And what the philosopher has to do is to purge common sense, to examine it, to discover what elements in it are, after all, doubtful, and not to rest until he has found what Russell called the hard data, the data which resist the critical examination of the inquiring philosopher. Now, if you think of it, you will perhaps agree with me that this program is not, after all, so very different from that of Descartes. Descartes asked, "Let me try and doubt everything possible, and what remains will be what is absolutely certain." Russell says, "No doubt common sense, on the whole, says what is true. Nevertheless, there is a good deal involved in common sense that should be purged. Let us purge it, and what remains will be what can really be trusted." In fact, Russell is in the great tradition of the skeptical philosophers. He himself has invoked Descartes and Hume, and his whole teaching has been an attempt to carry through this same tradition. I think for myself that the end is nothing but skepticism, that Russell, for all his hopes and his unfailing ingenuity, his dialectical skill, can say nothing at the end but what Descartes said. And now finally, to bring this very sketchy Cook's tour of history to a close, let me mention just one more and the last of the historical figures that I want to bring to your attention. There died a few years ago, in 1951, a philosopher named Ludwig Wittgenstein, who was a pupil of Russell's and taught in Cambridge for many years, wrote one short and very mysterious and difficult book, the so-called Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, whose contents are as puzzling to most people as its title, and wrote nothing else in his lifetime, and yet exercised an influence on Anglo-Saxon philosophy as great as anybody I could mention, greater probably even than Moore. I think it is fair to say that the problems and the methods of contemporary philosophical analysis are derived from Moore and from Wittgenstein, with a considerable side influence from Russell, provided you bear in mind that these men themselves came at the end of a very long philosophical movement. But now perhaps the time has come to stop talking about history and to try to explain what exactly one means nowadays by philosophical analysis. Let me say a word or two first about the meaning of analysis itself. The term means, etymologically, something like the separation of a whole into its parts. If the separation is actually performed, what you get is some sort of dissection and destruction of the whole with which you started. And for this reason, there have been philosophers who have been very distrustful of analysis and have coined the slogan that analysis is destruction. They want to approach experience in the round, as it were, and they feel that if you start tagging the parts and concentrating upon the details, that you run a risk of destroying everything in the experience that makes it valuable. I think myself this is a very short-sighted view, and that the attempt at understanding always means the bringing to a clearer focus the elements of a complex, becoming aware at the same time of the relations that those elements bear to one another. This is not something that philosophers perversely undertake. It's something that we all do whenever we try to understand more clearly any difficult subject matter. If you're not content, say, with an idea like democracy, but start asking, what does democracy consist in? You are beginning a process of analysis. And if you get an answer that contains more than one word in it, you can be quite sure that your answer is the statement of an analysis. Analysis is no more mysterious and no more unfamiliar than the formula H2O, which gives us, at any rate, a crude analysis of the nature of water. Well, now, the important point about contemporary philosophical analysis is first that it is an analysis of meaning. That, as I indicated in my remarks about Moore, where earlier philosophers tended to say, what is the evidence for such and such? Or, how do we know such and such? The analyst today tends to ask, what is the meaning of such and such? With the idea that very often, when you know the meaning, you won't need to raise the question of evidence at all. Now, I propose to give you a number of illustrations of the method, because I think these illustrations will really be more helpful than generalities about what is done by analysts. As my first illustration, I will start with the question that a child might ask about electricity, or for that matter, that a grown man or woman might be led to ask. And the question is quite simply, what exactly is electricity? I imagine the child saying, I can see a great many things that electricity does. I can see the lights burning, the sparks, radio. I understand that all of this is something done by electricity, but what exactly is electricity? I'm quite sure that this is a question that must have been asked hundreds of times in modern times. Now, how are we to answer? I suppose, if we were unscrupulous enough, we might say to the child, well, electricity is a sort of a current. It's something flowing through the wires. And this answer is all right if you don't take it seriously. But the child, being literal-minded, will very likely take it seriously and will have a picture of little blue sparks or little wavelets flowing through the copper wire. And if he has this, he is certainly being misled. But these pictures are very hard to get out of our minds. Probably all of us, if we think of electricity, think of something like little sparks passing through wires. But the fact is, of course, that if you took the most powerful microscope and looked at the interior of the copper wire, you wouldn't see any sparks, and you would be mistaken if you expected to see them. Indeed, this is a rather peculiar question, if you think about it a little more. What exactly does one want to know about electricity? Or put it this way, what kind of an answer really would satisfy the child or the adult who asks the question? There is one answer that is undoubtedly correct, and that is that electricity is electricity. But it's hardly to be expected that this will satisfy the person who raised the question. We might try saying it's a sort of force, but you notice that the qualification sort of at once destroys the force of the answer. It's a force, only different. It's like weight, but of course it isn't. I can remember children, and this is an actual example, being very puzzled about what happens when these supposed waves collide in space. Suppose you have two beams of light or two radio signals crossing over. Isn't there some sort of collision? The more you think about these pictures, the harder you find it is to sustain them. Now, I believe the right answer is to say that the question has been misconceived. That if you want to know what kind of thing electricity is, you are thinking of electricity on the analogy of an agent who does something. If you come into a house and see the furniture flying around, you may very reasonably ask who is doing this. And until you discover some agent, you may well feel that you are misinformed. It is very difficult to get the idea that things may happen, things may be done, without there being any question of an agent at all. And yet, after all, there are very simple and familiar expressions in language and corresponding ideas in our minds which make this very plausible. Suppose a child were to say, "I hear you say, 'It is raining.' What's this 'it' that you talk about? Who is this 'it'? Where do I find it?" Now here we should have no hesitation at all, I think, in saying this is just a manner of speech. There's rain, and that's the end of it. There's no something or other, a rain god or a spirit or a sort of force that is doing the raining. There is just the rain. And I believe the same is true in the case of electricity. And what we have to do in a case like this is to try and understand the logic of the expression, and that if we do, we can see that it isn't necessary to give an answer to the question, but that a fuller understanding of what the question is, in a way, provides its own answer, because the question dissolves, the questioner is satisfied without our formally having answered the question he raised. Let me mention a second and rather more difficult problem. People have sometimes said there must be, in some sense, in the universe, not only the flesh and blood people that you meet on the streets, but also the people that you meet in fiction. After all, we know a good deal about Hamlet. In fact, you might say we know more about Hamlet in some respects than we do about our neighbor living next door. We know his feelings towards his mother. We know his hesitations with regard to Ophelia, and so on and so on. Now, how is it possible that we should know all these things about Hamlet unless Hamlet is in some sense real? If Hamlet is just nothing at all, then we find ourselves in the position of claiming to have all sorts of specific and detailed information about just nothing at all. Therefore, Hamlet is real. And therefore, there are two sorts of men, flesh and blood men, and fictitious men. And now, if you once start thinking in this way, you will find yourself led into very strange consequences. For example, take instead of Hamlet, Mr. Pickwick. And let us suppose that, according to the Pickwick papers, Mr. Pickwick is in London on such and such a day, and then the next we hear about him, he's arrived in Nottingham a week later. Where was he in between? Now, in the case of a flesh and blood man, you know that he can't go from London to Nottingham without passing all the points in between. But what about Mr. Pickwick? Must there have been some route that he took? And is this a matter for legitimate research? Should we have a branch of, as it were, fictitious topography in which we study the travels, as some people have done in the case of Sherlock Holmes, of Pickwick and Hamlet and so on? I think the more you think about such questions as these, the more you will have the feeling that the question is insoluble, and I think you will be right. Because here again, we have been led or misled by a mistaken analogy. We can talk about Hamlet, and for that matter, about the devil, or about ghosts and fairies, and we can talk in much the same language about flesh and blood people. There is then a very strong temptation in thought to suppose that what is said about flesh and blood people must also be true of the persons in fiction, only as it were in a diluted sense. And so we have this idea of a shadowy kind of existence, a limbo in which all of these ghosts, these half-real creatures live. Some philosophers have, again, seriously maintained this to be so. But I believe that the correct answer is, again, to explore the logic of the language we use in talking about characters in fiction, and that if we do this, if we analyze the meaning of the statements we use in talking about fiction, we can, if we persist, come to see the differences, the distinctions of meaning, and we can rid ourselves of the inclination that we may have to suppose that there must be a special realm in which these fictitious characters exist. I should say that the illustrations I'm using are mere illustrations. I'm not pretending that any brief comments I make about them really dispose of these large and ancient problems, but I think that by running over a few more such problems, I may give you some inkling of the kind of work that's going on today. Let us take a third example, and a famous one. A man might sometimes fall into a frame of mind in which he wonders whether other people see just the same colors as he does. After all, there are colorblind people. How do I know that my wife or my best friend really sees exactly the same colors as I do? No doubt there are differences. But now pursue this doubt a little further. What would it be like if my best friend saw green where I saw red, red where I see blue, blue where I see yellow, and so on, seeing different colors each time, and yet still making distinctions between colors, just as he does at present. Now, if you think about this, you may come to have the disturbing thought that another person might have the color spectrum completely reversed or jumbled, and just so long as he spoke consistently, there would be no way of finding out. And if you have taken this step, then perhaps you will be philosophical enough to pursue your doubt consistently and start asking a still more disturbing question: how do I know that he sees colors at all? Perhaps when I see a color, he hears a sound. And when I hear a sound, he hears a color. And again, if his behavior jibed with mine all the time, how could I ever find out? I can't get inside his own mind. Perhaps when I feel pain, he feels pleasure. Perhaps when I feel pleasure, he feels pain. And now there remains only one further step. How do I know that he has any experiences at all? Suppose God were to make a dummy that looked exactly like a human being and behaved just like a human being, but had no experiences at all. How could I tell the difference? Answer, I couldn't. And now you're back to one of the most ancient of philosophical problems, the problem of the so-called existence of other minds. Now, this, I believe, is a much harder question than the others I've used by way of illustration. But here, too, I will say briefly that the contemporary view of this problem is that by examining the meaning of the key terms used, one can see that gradually a certain subtle shift occurs so that the key terms like color, experience, pain, and knowledge are gradually given such very special senses that it really does become impossible to know that somebody else is in pain. But you have only to shift from these philosophical doubts to the position of common sense to realize that you do know perfectly well that other people have experiences. Are you really in doubt about this? This is an appeal ad hominem, as the logic books say, but it is nevertheless a perfectly sound appeal, and one that I think the resources of modern-day philosophy can make thoroughly convincing. I will end by giving you just one more example of many more that could be used, namely the old problem about the reliability of prediction or statements about the unobserved. It is remarkably irritating to be asked by a philosopher how one knows that the sun will rise tomorrow. I remember one student who, being part of a captive audience, could do nothing but attempt to answer this question, saying in desperation, "I know that the sun will rise tomorrow because it is already rising tomorrow somewhere on the Earth's surface." This was at any rate an attempt to answer it. But if you try to answer the question, you will find yourself appealing, say, to astronomy or to mechanics. And when the question is pressed, when you're asked how you know that the stars and the other heavenly bodies will continue to behave tomorrow as they have done in the past, all you can say is, well, after all, they always have, haven't they? But now this is the very question. How do we know that things that have behaved in a certain way in the past will continue to do so? Couldn't a very young child, if it were philosophical enough, argue perhaps that its diet would consist exclusively of milk and be disappointed one day and startled out of its philosophical wits by discovering that this was a poor induction? And isn't perhaps our own belief that the world will continue to behave in the way that it has done simply a product of habit? And might it not be that tomorrow, just tomorrow, the long run of accidents will come to an end, and we shall wake up and find not the sun rising, but the moon, or nothing at all? Such questions are extraordinarily difficult to answer. The problem of induction, so-called, has also been termed the scandal of philosophy, because none of the philosophers of the past have really been able to settle it. I believe that today we can settle this problem, but once again, by examining very closely the meaning of the questions that are put by conducting long, painstaking, detailed investigations into the logic of the concepts that enter into these fundamental and difficult questions, we can show once again that certain subtle and important shifts in meaning have occurred, and of such a nature that the problem is rendered insoluble by the terms in which it's set. The real reason, in my judgment, why these problems have been insoluble in the past is that they have been made insoluble by the people who presented them. It's as if a man were to tell me to go from New York to Ithaca, but without leaving Ithaca at all. That would certainly be impossible, but I don't suppose any important theoretical consequences would follow. At any rate, I hope I've been able to give you a glimpse or two of what seems to me some very exciting contemporary work. It can be nothing more than a glimpse, because in philosophy, as in all other subjects, one has to see the details in order really to learn anything. But it may be sometimes of value to have a visitor from the workshop to be informed that there are exciting things going on, and I believe these things are exciting. And I believe they should be better known because, for one thing, the questions raised about language, meaning, the interrelation of thought and language, carry far beyond the confines of technical philosophy and are of interest, I believe, to all thinking persons. Thank you very much.